The lawyer's office smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, and I sat there in a stiff chair thinking about how my husband of 22 years had planned this moment down to the very last detail, without ever saying a single word to me about it. Let me back up. My name is Linda, and I am 51 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house in Greenville, South Carolina, the same house my husband and I bought when our daughter was 2. The neighbors know me as the woman who keeps her flower beds neat and waves from the driveway. My co-workers at the dental office know me as dependable, quiet, always the first one to bring something for the potluck. Nobody who looks at me would guess that I spent the last 19 years of my marriage carrying a secret so heavy it changed the shape of my spine. I swear I can feel it when I stand. This slight curve forward, like my body decided to fold in on itself rather than hold the truth upright. I need to tell you what I did, and then I need to tell you what my husband did, because what he did was so quiet, so patient, so completely invisible, that by the time I understood it, he was already gone. I met my husband Daniel when I was 27. He was 30, an electrical engineer with a calm face and steady hands. The kind of man who fixed things without being asked and never made a big deal about it. We met at a friend's cookout in August, and within 6 months we were engaged. He was the first man I'd ever been with who made me feel genuinely safe. Not swept away. Not obsessed. Just safe. I didn't know then that I would spend the next 2 decades destroying that feeling one lie at a time. The affair started when I was 32. My daughter was 3. Daniel was traveling for work 2 weeks out of every month, and I was alone in that house with a toddler and a job I was barely holding together. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. But I want you to understand the geography of how it happened. The way loneliness has a texture, it gets into the walls, into the smell of the sheets, into the silence after a child finally falls asleep and you sit on the couch and realize there is nobody to talk to. His name was Marcus. He was my neighbor's brother, visiting from Charlotte, and he came over twice to help me move furniture into the garage after our basement flooded. He was funny and present in a way that felt like oxygen after a long time underwater. I knew it was wrong the first time. I told myself it would be the last time every single time after that, and it wasn't the last time for 8 months. I ended it. Marcus moved back to Charlotte, and I convinced myself that what happened stayed in those 8 months like a sealed room, that if I never opened the door again, it would eventually stop existing. Daniel never seemed to suspect anything. He came home from his work trips. He fixed the screen door. He took our daughter to the park on Saturday mornings. He was the same man he had always been, and I was a completely different woman pretending to be the same. For 2 years it worked. I almost believed my own story. Then one evening in November, I was cleaning out an old email account, one I'd used during those 8 months, one I thought I'd deleted, and I found a thread I hadn't seen. I don't know how I missed it. Messages between Marcus and a mutual friend forwarded somehow into my inbox, talking about me. My name, our situation, details that were nobody's business but mine. What I didn't know and wouldn't know for years was that Daniel had seen those emails before I did. He had been using my laptop to print a work document, and the browser had been left open. He saw enough in 30 seconds to understand everything. He told me this 19 years later, sitting in a hospice room in Spartanburg with an IV in his arm, 2 weeks before he died. He said he sat at that kitchen table for 4 hours after I went to sleep that night, just sat there in the dark, and decided he was not going to say anything. Not because he forgave me. He was clear about that, because he didn't know what else to do with the information. That was how the silence started. Not with an argument, not with a confrontation, not with anything dramatic that I could have grabbed onto and used to navigate. Just a man sitting in a dark kitchen, deciding to swallow something whole, and me sleeping upstairs with no idea that the entire foundation of my life had just shifted 3 inches to the left. If you had asked me for the next 10 years whether something was wrong in my marriage, I would have said yes, probably in the way that things are wrong in most marriages. We had grown apart a little. He worked a lot. I worked a lot. Our daughter was in school, then middle school, then high school, and the business of raising her took up most of the air in the house. We were kind to each other. We ate dinner together most nights. We went to her school plays. We argued about money the way normal couples argue about money. Briefly, not meanly, reaching a conclusion and moving on. But he never reached for me, not once. Not a hand on my back in the kitchen, not a kiss that meant anything, not the easy physical shorthand that couples develop over years of living together. It had been there before, and then it wasn't. I told myself it was the natural cooling of a long marriage. I told myself I didn't deserve to want more given what I'd done. I told myself 100 small lies to avoid the one large one. Our daughter, Brianna, noticed before I did. She was 16 when she asked me once, carefully, whether her dad and I were happy. I said yes too quickly. She looked at me the way teenagers look at adults when they already know the answer and are testing whether you'll be honest. And then she nodded and left the room. She never asked again. Daniel was an excellent father. I want to say that clearly because it matters to who he was. He drove Brianna to track practice at 5:30 in the morning without complaint for 3 years. He taught her how to change a tire in the driveway the summer she turned 17. He came to every single graduation, every ceremony, every recital she had from the time she was small. Whatever he had decided to withhold from me, he never withheld from her. I used to watch them together and feel something I didn't have a word for. Gratitude and grief braided so tightly together, they felt like the same emotion. Brianna grew up, moved to Atlanta for a marketing job, got serious with someone named Trevor. She came home for holidays, called us both every Sunday. Normal. Good. Everything I had wanted for her. Daniel retired at 62. He put in 30 years with the same engineering firm, and they gave him a party, a plaque, a very nice watch that he wore every day until he couldn't anymore. I was 59. I thought, honestly, that retirement might change things between us. I had this naive idea that with more time at home, more mornings without an alarm, we might find each other again the way couples sometimes do when the structure of work falls away. I bought nicer coffee. I suggested walks. I tried. He was pleasant. He was never unkind. And he remained, in every physical and emotional sense, completely unreachable. That fall, I found a lump. Left side, routine mammogram. A callback that I almost didn't take seriously. I sat in the same kind of sterile office I'd sat in 100 times in my life. And I listened to a doctor explain that it was caught early, that we had options, that the prognosis was good with treatment. I drove home and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. Daniel was at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. He still got the actual paper, had it delivered, something I had teased him about for years. I sat down across from him and I told him. I watched his face, carefully, the way I had taught myself to watch his face over 20 years of trying to read a man who had learned to show nothing. He set the paper down. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "We'll deal with it." We. I held on to that word longer than I should have. He came to every appointment. He drove me to chemotherapy without being asked, sat in the waiting room for hours, brought a cooler with ginger ale and crackers for the drive home. He was there the morning they told us the margins were clear, sat beside me in that office while I cried with relief, and when I reached over and grabbed his hand, he let me hold it. He didn't pull away, but he didn't hold back either. I didn't know how to read it. I still don't, fully. Treatment took 8 months. I lost my hair, lost weight, spent a lot of time on the couch watching things I don't remember. Daniel cooked during those months. Nothing elaborate, simple things, soups and sandwiches, and the one pasta dish he'd always made that I had always loved. He kept the house running. He kept me running. And every night he went to the guest room and closed the door quietly, and I lay in our bed alone and wondered what I was to him by that point. A duty, a habit, something he was finishing out of a sense of obligation so old it had calcified into character. I finished treatment in March. By June I felt like myself again, mostly. Brianna and Trevor got engaged. The world kept moving the way the world does. It was Trevor, actually, who first noticed something was wrong with Daniel. He came down that Christmas, they both did, stayed for 5 days, and he pulled me aside on the second day and said, carefully, that my husband seemed tired in a way that wasn't normal. I said he'd been sleeping more. Trevor said, not tired, something else. Trevor was an ICU nurse. I should have listened faster. Daniel had been hiding symptoms for months. He finally told me in January, sitting at that same kitchen table, that he had seen a doctor in October and that the news was not good. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, already moved into surrounding tissue. He had spent 3 months knowing this and saying nothing, scheduling his own consultations, making his own decisions, the same way he had apparently spent 19 years, handling everything alone, in the dark, without asking for help. I remember screaming at him for the first time in our entire marriage. I stood in that kitchen and screamed about the 3 months, about the secrecy, about what he had been thinking. He sat there and let me. When I finished, he said, I didn't want to interrupt your recovery. I didn't know whether to love him for that or hate him for it. We had 8 months. Brianna moved back temporarily, worked remote from the guest room, and the 3 of us occupied that house in a way that was both terrible and, somehow, the closest we had been as a family in years. Trevor came most weekends. Daniel had good days and hard days. On his good days, he sat on the back porch with coffee and talked with Brianna for hours about everything, her childhood, her grandmother, stories about his own father I had never heard. I would listen from the kitchen window, not wanting to interrupt, just taking it in. He and I talked more in those 8 months than we had in the previous 10 years. Not about everything, not yet, but about Brianna, about the house, about practical matters that needed sorting before he couldn't sort them anymore. There was a gentleness to him that I hadn't felt directed at me in so long that the first time I felt it clearly, I went to the bathroom and cried quietly for 10 minutes with the fan on. 2 weeks before the end, he asked Brianna to take Trevor out to dinner. Just the 2 of them. He wanted to talk to me alone. It was a Tuesday evening. He was in the hospital bed we had set up in the downstairs bedroom, propped on pillows, the light coming in low and orange from the window. He looked small in a way that frightened me every day and never got easier. I sat in the chair beside the bed and held his hand, and he talked for almost an hour. He told me about the laptop, about the kitchen, about the decision he made that night in the dark. He said it quietly, without drama, the way he did most things. He said he had asked himself for years whether he made the right choice, and he still didn't know. He said the silence hadn't been a punishment, not exactly, though he understood if it felt that way. He said he didn't know how to be angry at me and stay at the same time, so he had done the only thing he could figure out. Stayed, and kept the anger somewhere so deep it eventually became something else. What it became he couldn't name. Less than peace. More than nothing. He said he was sorry he had never said it before, that the not saying had cost us both something real. I couldn't speak for a long time. I just held his hand and looked at the orange light on the wall. I asked him whether he had been happy. Not in the way people ask to be reassured. I genuinely wanted to know before it was too late to ask. He thought about it for a while. He said there had been a lot of happiness in his life. Brianna, his work, the mornings. He mentioned specifically the mornings on the back porch, the coffee, the way the yard looked in early fall. He said he didn't regret the years. He didn't say he didn't regret me. But he didn't say he did either. He died on a Thursday morning in September, with Brianna holding one hand and me holding the other. It was peaceful in the way that word means something specific. No struggle, just a slow going. The room was quiet. The window was open. 3 weeks later, I was in a lawyer's office in downtown Greenville, sitting across from an attorney named Mr. Hadley, who had been Daniel's personal attorney for 15 years. Not our family attorney, his personal attorney, a detail I had not known until the phone call. Brianna was beside me. Trevor was in the waiting room because he hadn't been invited to this particular meeting, which Mr. Hadley made clear on the phone in his careful, neutral way. He began with the standard items, the house left jointly to me and Brianna, the retirement accounts divided, A savings account I hadn't known existed, a substantial one, earmarked for Brianna's future children in a trust that was airtight. Then he slid a folder across the table. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated 2 months before Daniel died, and a photograph. The photograph was of a young man, early 20s, dark-haired, with Daniel's exact jaw and Daniel's exact way of standing, one hand in his pocket, looking directly at the camera with a calm face. Mr. Hadley told us his name was Caleb. He was 23 years old and lived in Asheville, North Carolina. He was a junior electrical engineer at a small firm there. His mother was a woman named Renata who had worked alongside Daniel at a project site in Asheville for 14 months, starting the year I had the affair. The same year Daniel sat in the kitchen in the dark and decided to stay silent. He had known about Caleb since the boy was born. He had paid child support quietly through a private arrangement for 22 years. He had met with Caleb 3 times, once when the boy was 12, once when he was 18, and once 6 months before Daniel died. He had told Caleb about our family. He had told Caleb that he did not intend to disrupt anything, that he had made choices he could not undo, but that he wanted Caleb to know he was thought of and that his education and his start in life were taken care of. There was a second trust, same amount as Brianna's. He had made sure they were equal. The handwritten letter was addressed to me. I won't tell you everything it said. Some of it is mine, but there was one part near the end that I have read so many times the paper is soft along the fold lines. He wrote, "I stayed because I wanted to, not because I couldn't leave, because Brianna needed her family in one house, and I believed that was worth something, and because for all of it, I never stopped thinking of you as mine, even when I couldn't make myself act like it." I know that doesn't make sense. It's the truest thing I know how to write, Brianna cried. I didn't. Not there. I stared at the photograph of this young man with her father's jaw and felt the ground tilt in a way I didn't know ground could tilt anymore, like I had already used up every version of that feeling and found out there was still more. We drove home in silence. She made tea when we got back, not coffee, tea, the way Daniel always made it when one of us was upset. And we sat at the kitchen table where he had sat in the dark 30 years ago, and we didn't talk for a while. Eventually, she said, "Did you know about the other part?" I said, "No." I said there were things she should know, and that I would tell her when she was ready, and that I was sorry, that I had been sorry for a long time, that sorry was the smallest and most insufficient word in any language, but it was the one I had. She didn't ask what I meant right then. She looked at her tea, then she looked at me, with that same expression from when she was 16, the one that meant she already knew the shape of the thing, even without the details. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. I have thought about Daniel every single day since he died. I think about the kitchen and the dark and the decision he made at 30 years old that neither of us ever fully recovered from. I think about what he said in those last weeks, that the silence hadn't been a punishment, not exactly. I believe him, and I think it was one anyway. I think things can be true and not be what they intended, the way a frost can kill a garden that was loved and tended without ever meaning to. I think about Caleb in Asheville, with Daniel's jaw and Daniel's hands, starting his life in an office somewhere, and I wonder if he knows how carefully he was thought of. I hope he does. I hope Daniel found a way to tell him in those 3 meetings, in the trust, in the equal and exact amount that said without any room for doubt, "You count." I keep the photograph in the top drawer of my nightstand. I don't know what to do with it yet. Brianna knows it's there. We've talked about reaching out, slowly, in a way that doesn't intrude on a life that was built without us. We're not there yet. Maybe we will be. The house is very quiet now. The coffee is still good. The flower beds need work. I let them go last fall and didn't plant anything for spring. First time in 15 years. I'll get to them. I'm still figuring out how to be a person whose life looked one way from the outside for 22 years and looks completely different from where I'm standing now, inside it, with the doors open. He forgave me. I think he must have. You can't tend to someone the way he did through 8 months of treatment and 2 months of dying and still be carrying pure hatred. Something else was in there with him. Something softer than forgiveness, maybe, or more complicated, an understanding that people damage each other in ways they can't always name, and that the choice to stay is its own kind of answer, even when it doesn't feel like one. I'm not sure I've forgiven myself, that's honest. But I've started leaving the bedroom curtains open in the morning, letting the early light in. Daniel always said the light in that room at 7 a.m. was the best thing about the whole house. I used to close them so I could sleep longer. I open them now, every morning. It's the least I can do with the time I have left. There's a photograph in my nightstand drawer of a young man I never knew existed until 3 weeks after I buried my husband. He has Daniel's jaw. Daniel's way of standing with one hand in his pocket like he's quietly waiting for the world to catch up with him. I look at it some mornings and I think about cause and effect, not in any grand cosmic sense, just the plain mechanical way that one thing leads to another, the way a stone dropped in water doesn't ask permission before it makes its rings. I made a choice at 32. Daniel made a choice the same year, sitting alone in a dark kitchen. And then we both spent 22 years living inside the consequences of those two choices, without ever fully admitting that was what we were doing. That's how it works, I think. You don't usually feel the weight of a decision the moment you make it. You feel it slowly, in the quality of a silence, in the way a man who loved you stops reaching for your hand, in the gradual understanding that the life you're living has a shape you helped carve but would never have chosen if you'd been thinking clearly. What Daniel did, the staying, the driving to chemotherapy, the cooking, the equal trusts, that took something I didn't give him enough credit for when he was alive. It took the kind of moral clarity that isn't loud or obvious, that doesn't announce itself or ask to be seen. He knew what he'd done too. He wasn't innocent, not after Caleb, but he decided that Brianna deserved a father in the house, and that Caleb deserved a foundation, and that I, for reasons he couldn't fully name even at the end, was still worth tending to. That's not weakness. That's a man who understood something about responsibility that I spent most of my adult life avoiding. And Brianna, watching her reach across that kitchen table and put her hand on mine when she could have walked out the door, that said everything about what character actually looks like when it's tested. She didn't have all the facts yet. She gave grace anyway. I think that came from him. What I know now, at 51, sitting in a house that's too quiet and flower beds that need work, is that integrity isn't what you do when people are watching. Daniel kept those trusts equal. Nobody would have known if he hadn't. Nobody would have faulted him. He did it because his own sense of what was right didn't require an audience. I didn't have that. I made decisions in the dark and told myself they'd stay there. They didn't. They never do. Not because the universe is keeping score, but because the people we share our lives with are paying closer attention than we know. And the truth has a way of finding its shape in the end. In a photograph, in a folder slid across a lawyer's desk, in a letter soft along the fold lines from being read too many times. I'm not the same person I was at 32. I'd like to think that means something. I get up every morning and I open the curtains, and I try to live in a way that I could explain out loud without flinching. It's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do. It's also, I think, the only thing that makes any of the rest of it mean something.